Hey everyone, Jason here, digital marketing consultant, and one of the hardest and toughest questions to answer as an entrepreneur or business owner is how hard should we work? How many hours should we put in? What is the maximum we can put in today to make sure we not only achieve our results, but we're also not borrowing from our future health, longevity, and happiness? So timestamps below as we go through 3 sections, busting through some myths, going through some historical data, as well as some current scientific studies, and of course, finally, going through a simple 3-phase process to maximize the energy you put towards your work. So let's go ahead and jump in. We need to bust through some myths before we get into the studies and how to actually apply this to your own business and life. Now, the first myth deals with willpower, and that is hard work is just a function of willpower. If you're not working hard, it's because you don't have enough willpower. And at the end of the day, it actually isn't true. Sure, there is some willpower in sitting down and actually getting to work, but when it comes to the intensity of that work and how hard and how long you can go, there is actual biological limits, as you'll see when we get into the science section. You can't simply just expect your brain to go 100% the entire day. Think about it going to the gym. When you go to the gym, you work out, you hit the treadmill, you lift some weights, and then what do you have to do? You have to wait, you have to recover. You don't immediately go back 2 hours later and then lift again and expect that you're going to get better results. And our brain functions a very similar way. Now, on that same vein, the second big myth is somehow working hard is equated to time. Working hard and time are 2 completely different things. Think about it. We'll just go with our workout example again because we're treating our brain like a muscle. Think about when you would run a 100-meter race versus running a mile. Chances are when you start running that mile, you're going to go out a lot slower than if you were only running 100 meters, right? And that's simply because you have a further distance to go. And so when it comes to working hard, the amount of energy and how you feel at the end of that 100 meters could actually be just as much lactic acid and huffing and puffing as it could running the mile, right? And it's because the intensity of the 100 meters is really, really intense. You have to run really fast in order to succeed in that race, whereas the mile, you might have a more long, drawn-out pace because you're going a longer distance. So you can't expect to run a 100-meter pace for an entire mile, just like you can't expect to go your entire workday going at 110% and expect your brain to be able to keep up with that. And the third and final myth comes to the world around us, and that is other people are working harder than I am, and so I have to put in harder work, longer hours in order to keep up. And that's simply not true. So let's go ahead and jump into the science, and we'll kick things off with the overestimation problem. And this is going to handle myth number 3. So according to a 2011 study by the Labor Review, they found that people on average overestimate their work hours when asked how long they work, anywhere from 10 to 25 hours. So if you take a look at this little table here, you can see that if someone's saying they're working 74 hours or more, they're likely overestimating their hours by up to 25, which means they're probably in reality only working 50 hours. Now, something interesting with this particular table that I found is that the people who overestimated their hours the least actually wound up working more. So just keep this 50-hour average kind of in mind if we were to look at what these number ranges would get us in terms of a actual maximum. So now that we know our friends and colleagues are most likely overestimating their time, whether it's intentional or not, let's go ahead and take a look at how long biologically we're actually designed to work. So according to anthropologists who went and studied what we used to do when we were running around hunting and gathering, we as humans actually only worked 5 to 6 hours a day. Now, chances are you're here because, like me, you want to maximize the amount of hard work and probably want to work a little more than 5 or 6 hours. But just keep that in mind that our brains essentially developed in an environment where we only had to think 6 hours a day, a maximum of 6 hours a day. Now, moving on to our next set of case studies, let's go ahead and move on to where we are now in terms of knowledge work. The CDC did a massive study where they took a lot of different studies and they did some of their own and they compiled it into this 100+ page paper where they looked at the effects of productivity when it comes to longer shifts or working overtime. Now, instead of going through all these hundreds of pages, I'm going to distill it down into 3 big takeaways when it comes to figuring out how hard we can actually work and a little bit on how long we can actually work. So I'll link that in the description if you actually want to go through the details. Now, the first big takeaway here was that the total week hours play a significant role on the number of work hours per day. And what this means practically is the more time you want to work, the more days you need to spread that time out over. Now, the second big takeaway from this study was that they found that for the most part, work that was done in 10 hours could have just as easily been done in 8 hours. And one of the reasons behind this was the third big takeaway we have here, and that is that they found that a 50% increase in office hours only resulted in a 25 to 30% increase in productivity. So what does this mean practically? That means hours 9 and 10 of a workday are the equivalent of 15 minutes of productivity when compared to hour 1 or 2. So you work an hour 9 and 10 equal 15 minutes in terms of actual productivity in the morning. So I think that's incredibly powerful. And one of the biggest conclusions from this study was productivity does not necessarily equal time. So now that we know based on our biology, we were initially designed to work 5 to 6 hours a day. And we know that if we go over 8 hours in one day, we actually see dramatic diminishing returns. It's time to actually answer the question of, in those 6 to 8 hours that ideally you would have in a day for actual maximum productivity, how many of those hours can you go 100%? So we're going a level deeper here. We're not just saying how many hours a day or week you could work. You could easily do the math where between 6 and 8 hours a day, and you should probably do no more than 6 days a week or 6 days in a row before you actually take a break. But in terms of the time spent in that specific day, how many hours in that day can you go 100% from a biological standpoint? And the good news is we actually have an exact answer, because obviously we can't go 100% the entire day. So the same group of researchers behind Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule from his book Outliers also looked at the peak performance of multiple different disciplines across the globe. In this particular example, they were looking at violinists, and they found that at an elite level, for elite performance in terms of maximum concentration and disciplined practical practice, 4 hours was the absolute limit. In fact, they found that most violinists actually capped out around 3.5 for the elite, and then those that were novices or lower in their field, not necessarily terrible, right? We're talking about elite performance here, but lower on that elite scale, we're closer to the 1 or 2 hour mark in terms of their practice. And I'll link up that study in the description below as well. So the summary here is, based upon our biology, we're designed to work 5 to 6 hours per day. Based upon the study that we found from the CDC, once we go above 8 hours a day, we wind up seeing dramatic diminishing returns. And based upon this last study of deliberate, intense, hyper-focused practice using 100% of our brain capacity on something that's incredibly important, we cap out at 4 hours per day. Now you might be wondering, well, there's been times where I've seemed to have worked more, or I've been able to do more hours. And then chances are, spoiler alert, you probably weren't at 100%. So you weren't working as hard as humanly possible. Just like there are some people who go to the gym every day and they go on the treadmill every day, but they're not going 100%. And so that's something that you have to keep in mind when it comes to how hard you're working. Now, of course, you also want to keep in mind that those 4 hours that you have are most likely going to be spent on something that's incredibly important and best designed to move your business forward, which leads us into the practical application. So now that we have our frame of 6 to 8 hours a day is the optimal, and 4 hours of that we can count on our brains to go 110%. Of course, once we train ourselves to get up there, right? We're not going to start at 4 hours a day. The study was very clear that you're probably going to start at 1 or 1.5, because most of us just aren't used to using our brain with that level of intensity. And it really is intense. We'll get to that in a moment though. So let's go ahead, jump into step number 3 here of beginning to apply everything that we talked about to your work days to make sure that you work the hardest humanly possible without borrowing your longevity or future health. So phase number one is identifying the 2 to 3 things that absolutely matter the most in pushing your business forward. So as an example, right now for this quarter, my 3 most important things that I could never delegate to anybody else in my business is number 1, learning how to becoming the best virtual team leader I can. Number 2, being on camera like this presenting. And then number 3, sales copywriting. Now, chances are as a fellow entrepreneur or business owner, your disciplines are also going to include something about leadership or project management, as well as something that has directly to do with sales. And the third one is going to, of course, be unique to you and your business. Now, are there other things you have to do in your business? Absolutely. In your profession? Absolutely. But you need to choose the 3. You need to focus on those 3 that are the absolute top priority, most important, that you would never hire out or you would almost never delegate, because those things are what's going to push your business forward and push you as a professional in whatever your discipline or skill is forward. And those are the things that should get those 4 hours. When it comes to checking email or maybe you're doing some administrative tasks, yeah, do that later. Do that in the other 3 to 4 hours that you have in the day. But here you need to identify those 2 to 3 things that should get your highest level of concentration, because as we all know, a jack of all trades is definitely not a way to grow a business. So make sure you hit that like button, subscribe for more videos just like this one, and until the next, keep building the business you love.